All right, the White House continues its search for the anonymous writer of last week's explosive op-ed in the New York Times. On Friday, President Trump said he wants Attorney General Jeff Sessions to investigate, suggesting that the op-ed amounts to treason.
Do you think Jeff Sessions should be investigating who the author of the op-ed piece was, or who some of these people are talking to?
I think so, because I think it's national security. Yeah, I would say Jeff should be investigating who the author of that piece was, because I really believe it's national security.
You said last night that it's treason. What happened? In this country, we can punish treason with the death penalty. Are you serious about that?
We're going to take a look at what he had, what he gave, what he's talking about, also where he is right now.
What is it in the op-ed that would make it treason?
What makes you think the four corners? How are we secure, Chuck, that the four corners of any op-ed are all that somebody who doesn't have the guts and the courage to come out and put their name to that op-ed? How do we know they haven't promised other things? How do we know they're not taking other documents?
The President of the United States wants the Attorney General to investigate. What law was broken here that the Attorney General needs to investigate?
It depends. There could be and there could not be. And so you don't know that and I don't know that.
So he has ordered the Attorney General?
Nobody's investigating an op-ed.
Has he ordered the investigation of who wrote this op-ed?
I won't talk about that. He has said publicly that he thinks that we should find out who this person is.
Meanwhile, members of the Trump administration continue to deny any involvement in writing the anonymous op-ed. Vice President Mike Pence says he's confident it wasn't anyone on his staff.
Let me be very clear. I'm 100% confident that no one on the vice president's staff was involved in this anonymous editorial.
And you asked them?
Well, honestly, I don't have to ask them because I know them. I know their character. I know their dedication. And I am absolutely confident that no one on the vice president's staff had anything to do with this.
And U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, has written her own op-ed slamming the anonymous piece in the New York Times. And she writes in part this: when there is disagreement, there is a right way and a wrong way to address it. I pick up the phone and call him or meet with him in person. As a former governor, I find it absolutely chilling to imagine that a high-ranking member of my team would secretly try to thwart my agenda. That is not the American way. It is fundamentally disloyal, not just to the chief executive, but to our country and to our values. Heidi Przybyla, there's a lot of questions as to whether or not, not following the system in reaction to the president is the right way to go. I think it's a very slippery slope and extremely dangerous. And I have a lot of questions about this op-ed. But the investigation into who done it, that seems also to be a slippery slope as well. Calling it treason, also a slippery slope.
Did not hear from any of the administration officials, Mika, who hit the airwaves, a good explanation of how anything that was in that op-ed could qualify as treason. It was simply a member of this administration exercising their most fundamental right under the First Amendment to free speech. And by the way, it verified everything that has been reported in numerous books and in numerous articles since the beginning of this administration. But it does highlight, I think, a broader question that it someday will be reconciled here for the media and for the American people, which is just what extent has there been any kind of official coordination between this administration and the Justice Department? There are outside groups that have issued a flurry of FOIAs on everything from the AT&T Time Warner deal to other attacks that the president has made on news organizations to try and get to the bottom of whether there has been any violation of the contacts policy that we've had, frankly, since Nixon, because of this very problem that we saw illustrated at that time. And so I think this is just another example. It seemed like if you read between the lines, the administration was saying there has been no formal order from this White House. But I think given that everything that we've seen, going back to the days of the president launching his campaign, calling for an investigation of his political rival, there should be a lot of skepticism about that. And the American people deserve answers.
A whole lot of skepticism. And, this happens, Mark McKinnon, all the time in government. the most dramatic case, the Pentagon Papers. But in 2005, the Washington Post published black sites and methods that the United States government was using to try to thwart the next al-Qaeda attack. It happened with Barack Obama's administration, the CIA and the FBI leaking things they didn't want to hear. It happens all the time. And for Trump and his supporters to call this treasonous or sedition, as Eddie McCarthy of National Review and Fox News said, they just need to be quiet and stop embarrassing themselves. Anybody that's ever prosecuted a sedition case knows this is not sedition. This is not treason. This is someone exercising the First Amendment rights.
And patriotism. And just another example that should cause a lot of people some disturbance that President Trump is once again trying to direct the Justice Department for political reasons, not for any serious policy reasons, but when he gets news he doesn't like, he directs his Justice Department to investigate, to try and do things for him politically, which is really a problem. When the anonymous thing came out, I was struck because I remember being at the National Cathedral for McCain's funeral and thinking, there was just such that whole week, the accolades were so spectacular, and talking about a different time when our politics were different and maybe they could be that way again, and wondering if somebody would step up in a McCain-like fashion and who it might be now. And now we have a direct line between the timing of that editorial and the McCain services, which I thought was interesting. Now, I think John McCain would have put his name on it, but I do think that that
Yes.
person might have been inspired by last week.
Yeah, Nick, you work at the New York Times. You want to tell us this morning who it is? Because I will tell you
I'm sworn to secrecy,
that,
but I also have no answers for you, Joe.
Yeah, exactly. I will say that there are a lot of people that were expecting it to be a marquee name. Willie had a pretty good source that suggested that it wasn't someone that the rest of the country knows and actually has the name. We won't say it here today, but that name is slowly but surely getting around in Washington, D.C. Any concerns that if it's not a marquee name that everybody knows, that the Times may be accused of overplaying their hand?
Well, Joe, I don't speak for the paper, but yeah, I would say that I would hope and I expect and I'm sure that my colleagues on the op-ed page would not use the phrase senior administration official if it was not an actual senior person. But that said, that still leaves a fairly wide number of people. So if you adopt a strict definition of senior administration official, it's still dozens or 100 people that it could be, which is why it's a good use in news stories as well, that we often use to mask identities or have a source attribution. But hopefully it is a person who merits that title.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.